John Rawls revolutionized political philosophy in 1971 with the publication of his magisterial work, A Theory of Justice. Today I want to talk about Rawls's ideas. It's going to be just the briefest sketch of his theory of justice, but I think it conveys some of the key ideas. Rawls is a social contract theorist. Consequently, his theory falls into three parts. There's initially the question of the situation of choice. There is some hypothetical circumstance under which we select the principles under which we live. Perhaps we choose the state of nature, to have no political authority at all. But perhaps we do choose a state of government. But under what conditions? What is that circumstance of choice like? The second part involves criteria for making that choice. We've got a choice between the state of nature and a state of political authority, and then a further choice to make about the structure of that political authority, the limits to be placed on it, and in general, we're going to approach that choice on the basis of certain criteria. What criteria will we use for deciding whether to stay in the state of nature or to form some sort of political association? And if we opt for the latter, what will the structure of that political association be like? How will we go about choosing the set of social institutions under which we'll live together? The third part of the theory is then what principles will govern that set of social and political institutions that we create. Rawls has a distinctive view about each of those three components. First, let's talk about the circumstance of choice. Most social contract theorists here focus on the state of nature and give us a story about the state of nature. In Hobbes, for example, it's a war of all against all. Life is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. In Locke, the state of nature is not a state of war, but it is a state of insecurity. It's one where we have to band together into private associations to protect ourselves, and we risk being at the mercy of the posses, the vigilante groups, and so we seek impartial judgment. In Rousseau, it's a situation where we manage to survive, but barely, and great inequalities develop. We decide we'd do a lot better if we banded together and cooperated. Intriguingly, Rawls does not focus on the question of the state of nature. He doesn't really think about what the alternative to political authority is. He tends to simply assume that we will choose to construct political institutions. And then his concern is, well, what would make those political institutions just? Now here, the standard social contract theorist says, well, the fact that we would choose them. But Rawls says, well, wait a minute. People can choose all sorts of things under all sorts of circumstances. They may be under pressure. They may be coerced. They may be confused. There may be a situation of tremendous inequality. And if it turns out the people on the top, the elites, are choosing, and then the multitude that lack necessities, or at least lack any kind of political power, are being chosen for by the others, you might say, this is like two wolves and a sheep deciding what to have for dinner. This is not a good situation for those who are not in a position of power already. And so, Rawls says, look, we've got to talk about the circumstances of that choice more than social contract theorists generally have. Here's what he says. Let's call that hypothetical state where we make the choice the original position. It's the position from which we select between the state of nature and a state of political authority, and then what kind of political authority that will be. It's important that the original position satisfy certain conditions in order for a choice that's made there to be just. He describes his theory as a theory of justice as fairness. And what does he mean? First of all, that situation of hypothetical choice has to be fair. It has to be a choice made among a group of equal parties, all of whom have an equal status and an equal right to contribute to making the choice. So it's got to be a fair circumstance. Secondly, the people in that circumstance, if we're to respect the outcome as justice, had better be knowledgeable. If they're choosing social institutions or political structures out of ignorance, that's hardly going to constitute much of a justification of their legitimacy. But third, he says they have to choose from behind a veil of ignorance. What that means is that although they should know all sorts of truths about economics, political science, sociology, and so forth, nevertheless, they must be ignorant about themselves. they must be ignorant of their own talents, for example, their own capacities, their own tendencies and dispositions, their own character, their own conception of the good. So, they cannot manipulate the process in a way that favors them. The idea is this: they're selecting a political authority and a political structure that is going to be good for people in general, not just good for themselves. Maybe I love baseball. I think, well, we should have free, subsidized baseball games. But hold on a second. I shouldn't be able to be in a position to manipulate things in that way. Or maybe I like philosophy, and I think philosophers should be very highly paid and very highly honored in this structure. No, I am not allowed to choose on the basis of my own knowledge of my giving myself an advantage in this structure. So I've got to choose from behind a veil of ignorance. I can't know what my profession is, what my talents are, what my general physical characteristics are. I can't even know what my race is or my gender is, much less can I know my own conception of the good life or anything like that. Here's one way of thinking about it. I've got to imagine that I am an agent representing someone, and I don't know anything about that person. So I am supposed to represent the interests of my client. But who is this client? I have no idea. And so what I've got to do is come up with a structure that is going to be good for people in general, not just good for people like me or like some other particular person. The second component involves the criteria for making the choice. How do we go about making such a choice? Well, first of all, Rawls says, as does any social contract theorist, we should make the choice out of our own self-interest. If we come in with a moral conception or a conception of what fairness is in a way that's contentious, we're going to end up concluding that, well, really, in the end, we've just read our normative conclusions into the structure by putting in these normative premises. We shouldn't be allowed to do that. And so the whole idea is that this structure will have legitimacy because I would voluntarily choose it, under these fair circumstances, admittedly. But I would choose it because it's better for me. Think of it this way. Hobbes's entire idea with the social contract theory is to say that normativity, whether it's of an ethical kind, the ought, the should, the good, and so on, or of a more political kind involving justice and things that involve our lives together necessarily, these things are going to rest ultimately on rationality, on what it would be rational for me to choose, just given my own self-interest. So morality and politics in the end come down to rationality. That's the whole concept of the social contract theory. And Rawls says, well then good. First of all, we're going to have a criterion of choice, which is based on our own self-interest. But of course, our self-interest, once I am stripped of any conception of my own conception of the good, or my own talents or dispositions, profession, etc., etc. Now, the second part of this, the second criterion, is what he refers to as reflective equilibrium. I do have certain intuitions about what's right and wrong, what's just and unjust, but also what would be a good political arrangement, what would be a bad arrangement. And I am going to have to test my principles that I adopt against those intuitions. If I adopt a set of principles and they end up concluding that, well, it should be okay for some people to murder other people, I should intuitively recoil from that and say, wait, no, that can't be right. Now, sometimes when I think about principles and think about my own intuitive responses, I'm going to end up allowing my principles to triumph over my intuitive responses. Often it will be the reverse. I test my principles against my intuitive responses with respect to actual or hypothetical cases, and I say, well, no, that doesn't make any sense. There must be something wrong with the principles. One way of looking at this, in terms of a variety of psychologists' distinction between system 1 and system 2, that is to say, a system for thinking that is highly intuitive, very rapid, but perhaps a little less reliable, and then a system which is more rationally structured, which is conscious, which takes more time, but may be more reliable. Sometimes, well, those disagree, and so I have to bring them into alignment. I have to think, what principles should I adopt as axioms? Well, it depends what I want to follow here. And if I'm going to produce a social structure on the basis of these principles that I think intuitively can't be right, then I've got to revise those principles. But maybe sometime on principle, I'll think, maybe my intuitive response was wrong. So I'll try to bring them into an alignment, bring them into adjustment. The third criterion is what I've written down here as the Maximin rule. That is to say, I am going to approach this choice as if my enemy were going to assign me my place. After all, I don't know anything about myself under the veil of ignorance. I can't set this up to advantage myself, and I should be risk-averse. I should be worried about the potential that I am going to lose out in this social structure. So I want the bottom position, the minimum, in whatever society we create to be as good as possible. I'm going to seek to maximize the minimum. This is not the only attitude I might have. I could be, for example, a utilitarian and say, no, I want the greatest happiness overall. So I just want the largest amount of good. I'm not concerned primarily with the distribution of that good, and in particular what the minimum point of that distribution is and making that as high as possible. I just want the largest area under the curve, if you will. That's a very different attitude about choice. Much of ordinary rational decision theory takes that utilitarian line instead of Rawls's line. And there are many different positions in between. I might just be concerned with the minimum. I might be concerned with the area under the curve, the total amount of good or happiness or whatever it is I'm concerned about in the society. But there are many other ways in between of thinking about risk. Should I, in effect, ignore risk, as the utilitarian recommends? Should I be completely risk-averse, as Rawls suggests? Or should I have a different attitude about risk, taking risk into account, but also being concerned about the total expected return? The question arises, what would we choose in that condition of the original position using those criteria? He says there are two basic principles of justice we would choose. We would consider our social and political institutions just if they conformed to these two principles. What are they? First, a principle of maximal equal basic liberties. The basic liberties are those of political participation. So freedom of speech, freedom of thought, freedom of association, freedom of the press, the rule of law, rights to property. These things, he says, are fundamental to our ability to participate in political decision-making. And so we're not going to accept any social structure that denies those. Freedom of speech, freedom of thought, freedom of association, freedom of religion, freedom of all sorts of kinds that pertain to political decision-making are vital here. Now, why? Because I recognize that although in the original position I try to think this through, I try to test my principles against my intuitive responses and so on, my imagination is limited. There are going to be all sorts of cases in the future where either a new problem comes up and I have to decide what to do about that, or when a new kind of situation arises and I realize, well, wait a minute, my principles, I thought they matched intuitive responses pretty well, but wow, in this case they really don't. And so I have to rethink things. I want to be able to participate, much as I did in that original position, as an equal party to participating in a democratic process. And so it is going to be fundamental that I preserve my ability to participate. And I won't be able to participate appropriately unless I can think through issues, unless I can hear all sides, unless I can approach that with whatever conception of the good I've managed to evolve on the basis of my experience. So I am going to insist on basic liberties, basic conditions. I will want them to be equal. I will want everybody to have the same basic liberties, but I will want as much basic liberty in the society as is compatible with everyone having the same amount of basic liberty. The second principle more directly involves distributive justice. How should the goods and responsibilities of society be distributed among its members? Rawls says that they should be distributed in such a way that inequalities are, first of all, to be arranged to everyone's advantage. So everyone has to gain from an inequality. Now, at first glance, you might say, well, how is that possible? Surely the person who has more is benefiting more than the person who has less. Yes, but his point is the person who has less still has to be benefiting. If there weren't this inequality, that person would be even worse off. Now, at first glance, you might think, wait, but Rawls thinks it's very important to recognize that often in real social, political, and economic decisions, we've got a choice between a degree of inequality like this and then a smaller degree of inequality where people's welfare levels are like that. So in short, it's quite often the case that we are all better off if there's greater inequality. Remember Locke's argument about the advent of money. We agree to a monetary economy. Why? Because it makes all of us better off, even the people with relatively little money. They're still much better off than they would be if they had no money at all and simply had to barter for things. And so the advent of money is something that makes us all vastly better off. And so yes, it does allow for great inequality. But if we didn't have this type of situation, we'd have this type of situation. And so we're much better off with that kind of monetary exchange. The same thing is true in all sorts of respects, Rawls says. Many economic arrangements are such that they allow for greater degrees of inequality, but they also improve everyone's living standards. So we don't want to reduce inequality so much that we end up harming those on the bottom of the inequality. Sometimes he appeals to the Maximin rule much more directly and says that they have to be arranged for the benefit of the least advantaged. That is to say, the person on the bottom end of the inequality still has to benefit from the existence of the inequality. If it weren't like this, it would be like that. The second condition is that the inequalities are to be arranged so that they are attached to positions open to all. This first condition, about being to everyone's advantage, is often called the difference principle. The second one is generally known as the equal opportunity principle. And that's the central idea here. We can have inequalities, but they have to benefit even the people on the bottom end of the inequality. And secondly, they have to be attached to offices and positions that are open to everyone. Everyone has to have an equal chance to compete. It doesn't mean everybody has to have an equal chance to win or to actually gain the position or the office. There can be qualifications. And so it's not as if everyone should have a chance at any position in society and we should just choose them all at random. Instead, some people really do have dispositions and talents and abilities that enable them to perform very well. But we have to decide on the basis of the relevant criteria, on the basis of excellence with respect to that position, and give everyone an equal chance to participate and everyone an equal chance to compete for that position. So another way to put the equal opportunity principle is that we can't discriminate against people on the basis of irrelevant factors. I should have a chance to compete for that job. If I'm not the best qualified, fine, I shouldn't get it. But I shouldn't be excluded from the competition. Rawls puts it this way. These principles express justice as a complex of three ideas. Liberty, that's the first principle of maximal equal basic liberties. Secondly, equality, that's the second principle, that inequalities are to be arranged so that they are to everyone's benefit and attached to positions open to everyone. And then, reward for services contributing to the common good. So in other words, inequalities are acceptable. Inequalities are things that are not, by definition, unjust. It depends. Are they attached to positions open to everyone? In other words, are they the result of discrimination? If so, they're unjust. But if there's no discrimination, if there really was equal opportunity to compete for those positions, then that's fair, provided that, of course, we also satisfy the difference principle, that those inequalities are to everyone's advantage. We've got to seek to improve the lives of the least advantaged as much as possible, and choose the set of political institutions that are going to improve the lives of those at the bottom of the hierarchy as much as possible.